It was the kind of afternoon that arrived unremarkably, the way most life-altering moments did. The sky was a flat grey particular to late October, in cities that had forgotten how to do autumn gently, and the park was populated with the sparse midweek traffic of strollers and joggers, and people eating lunch alone on benches. Declan Vane had crossed through it because it was the faster route between the building where the meeting had ended and the building where the car was waiting, and the park was neutral territory in a way that open streets were not, and he had the particular habit of preferring spaces where he was unlikely to be recognized. He had his hands in the pockets of his coat and his attention on the path ahead and the running calculations of the afternoon, the logistics of an operation 3 cities away that had developed a complication in the last 18 hours, and he was not thinking about the trees, which had gone to yellow, or the bench to his left where a woman had left a child's shoe lying on its side, or the 2 small figures who came around the curve of the path ahead of him at a speed that was specifically the speed of children who had been told to stay close and had decided that close was a relative term. They were running side by side, which was how he registered them first, not as individuals but as a pair, the specific synchrony of children who had been together since before they had language for togetherness. They were wearing matching jackets, dark blue, and they were arguing with each other in the uninhibited shorthand of people who had never needed to translate for each other, and one of them nearly ran into the leg of an older man walking a dog, and the other pulled the first one sideways by the sleeve, with the automatic competence of someone who had been doing exactly this for as long as they had been able to reach. They were, he estimated, somewhere around 3 years old. His eyes passed over them with the same automatic register he applied to everything in a space he was moving through, the kind of attention that filed things without stopping to examine them, and then something happened that he had no framework for, and would not have for several seconds. His feet stopped. He had not made the decision to stop. His feet simply ceased to move forward, and he was standing on the park path, with the 2 small figures still in his field of vision, now approximately 15 feet ahead of him, and his brain was in the process of catching up with what his body had apparently already understood. The taller of the 2 had turned to look back at something, and in turning had presented his profile to the afternoon light, and the profile was a thing that Declan had seen before, had in fact seen every morning for 34 years in mirrors and glass surfaces, and the occasional photograph, and the angle was wrong for a mirror, and there was no glass between them, and the child was 3 years old, and impossibly, undeniably, wearing his own jaw and his own brow, and the specific arrangement of features that his own mother had once called a face that knew its own mind before the rest of you did. He stood on the park path and was entirely still in the way that he was still when something required the full weight of his processing and everything else needed to clear the field. The smaller of the 2 had now also turned, looking for whatever his brother was looking at, and presented in doing so an identical profile. The same jaw, the same set of the brow, the same quality of attention in the eyes that he could read across 15 feet of grey October air. Identical to each other, and to him. He had understood in the abstract that identical twins were a thing that happened in the world. He had not understood, until this moment, what it felt like to see your own face reproduced twice on 2 small strangers, who were engaged in an argument about something involving a stick on the ground to the left of the path. His mind produced the word twins, and then produced the word his, and then produced a year, 3 years ago, and a name, and around the name a whole architecture of memory that he had spent considerable effort not examining on most days, and which was now fully assembled and present in the late October air of a park in a city that was not his city. He heard a voice then. It came from somewhere behind the children, from the direction of the bench he had registered without examining as he came around the curve, and it said their names, 2 names that were different from each other and would sort themselves out later in his memory, and the voice itself landed in his chest the way voices did when the body recognized them before the mind had finished processing. He watched the children turn toward the voice. He watched them move toward the bench. He moved toward the bench himself. 3 steps, 5, and the woman who had been seated there was rising, had turned away from him in the act of gathering a bag and a jacket that had been laid beside her, and he stopped again, waiting, because something in him understood that this was the moment, and that moments of this weight could not be rushed without cost. She turned around. The 3 years had done what 3 years did, which was continue, and she wore them in the specific way of someone who had been busy, someone whose days had had too much in them to leave space for the kind of stillness that showed in faces. She was looking at her children before she saw him, the quick maternal inventory of a parent verifying that both are present and uninjured, and her hand went to the smaller one's shoulder in the automatic gesture of a person who had been making this gesture for 3 years without thinking about it, and then her eyes moved up and encountered him, and she went very still. He had tried, in the years since she had gone, to remember exactly what her face looked like in unguarded moments. It was harder than he had expected. He had memories of her face in context, in motion, in the specific configurations of conversation and attention, and the particular expressions she deployed in professional settings, and the different ones she deployed when they were not in professional settings. What he had lost and could not reconstruct from memory was the quality of her face when she was not doing anything with it, when it was simply her face being her face, with no purpose attached to the expression. He was seeing that now, the lack of purpose, the lack of preparation, the pure unedited registration of someone encountering the thing they had not expected to encounter in a park in the middle of a grey October afternoon. He said her name. It came out quietly, which he had not planned, and without the shape of a question, which also had not been planned but which was accurate, because he was not asking whether it was her. He knew it was her. He had known it was her from the first syllable of her voice. He said her name the way you said a thing that you had been holding in your chest for a long time and had not been certain you would ever get to say to the face it belonged to. She did not run. He had not been entirely certain she would not run, had understood that the probability was real, had anticipated it without preparing for it, because preparation would have required deciding in advance what he would do, and he had not been willing to do that. Instead, she stood, with her hand still on the smaller child's shoulder, and looked at him with the specific quality of someone conducting an assessment they had been unconsciously running for 3 years, checking the actual against the expected. The children were looking at him. He was aware of this in the way he was aware of things at the edges of a situation, as information to be integrated rather than addressed directly. They had the uncomplicated directness of small children encountering a stranger, interested, evaluative, not yet concerned. The taller one had moved slightly closer to his mother in a gesture that was protective in the unconscious way of children who had not yet learned that size was supposed to precede protection, and the quality of the gesture landed somewhere in Declan's chest in a way he did not immediately have words for. She said a sentence, and it contained 2 names, names that were different from each other, and she looked at him while she said them, and he understood that this was not an explanation and not an introduction. It was an offering of information that she had been carrying alone and was now choosing to share, not because she had no choice, but because the alternative was not keeping the secret, since the secret was standing in a park in duplicate wearing his face, but because she had made a decision in the 3 seconds after she saw him about what the next moment should contain. The smaller one looked from Declan to his mother and back to Declan with the frank, analytical attention of someone who was 3 years old and had therefore not yet learned to pretend that he was not doing exactly what he was doing. He said something to his brother in the shorthand they had been using when they came around the corner, and his brother responded in kind, and whatever conclusion they reached between them had the quality of a provisional verdict. This stranger was not a threat, was possibly interesting, and could be assigned to the category of things to be examined further when circumstances permitted. Declan looked at them for a long time. He was aware that he was standing in a park, in a city that was not his city, and that his car was still waiting, and that the complication 3 cities away had not resolved itself while he was standing here, and none of that was available to him as anything other than peripheral noise. What was available to him, entirely and without competition, was this: the 2 faces, the 1 woman, the 3 years that had happened in between, and the specific quality of the afternoon light on all of it, grey and honest and without ceremony, which was perhaps the appropriate light for the kinds of truths that arrived not with announcement but with a turn of the head. He looked at her. She looked at him. The children looked at both of them with the generous impartiality of people who had not yet learned that some moments were supposed to be private. The park continued around them in the ordinary way of parks on Wednesday afternoons. Dogs and strollers and the occasional jogger, and the yellow trees were doing what yellow trees did in late October, which was hold on as long as possible and then let go, and Declan Vane stood on the path where his feet had stopped and understood that the life he had been living for 3 years, the one organized around a specific absence, had just encountered the thing it had been organized around, and that everything from this moment forward would need to be reorganized accordingly. He took a step toward her, not toward the children, not toward the bench, but toward her specifically, a single step, and he was aware that the step contained a question, that he was not asserting anything with it but asking whether the space between them was one she was willing to reduce, and she did not step back, which was its own answer. And he took another step, and the children moved with their mother as children did, gravity toward the person they depended on, so that when he stopped, he was standing close enough to see the specific things that 3 years had added to her face, and she was looking up at him with the expression of someone who had prepared for many versions of this encounter, and was finding that none of them quite fit the actual version, which was happening in a park in the grey light on a Wednesday without warning and without ceremony, which was, he supposed, the most accurate way for it to happen. He did not say anything further. Neither did she. The smaller one tugged on his mother's sleeve and said something about the stick on the ground that he had been interested in earlier and that he apparently wanted to revisit, and the mother looked down at him and then back at Declan, and there was something in her face that was not yet forgiveness and was not yet anything that had a clean name, but that was also not refusal, and that was enough. For this particular moment, on this particular path, in this particular city, that was not his city but was apparently the city where this was going to begin. The apartment she had been living in for 14 months was on the 4th floor of a building that had the particular character of buildings that had been renovated once, well, and then left to age at their own pace. The elevator worked most of the time. The hallways were clean. The neighbors were the kind of people who nodded in passing and did not require more than that, which was a quality she had specifically sought when she had been choosing between the available options 14 months ago. It was the 3rd place she had lived in the 3 years she had been away, which meant she had been moving on a schedule that was not random but was not entirely planned either, a drift southward and then westward that had followed the logic of available work rather than any destination. And this city, which was the current destination, had offered her a contract that was long enough to justify staying, and not so long that leaving would have consequences. She had gotten very good, in 3 years, at choosing situations from which leaving would not have consequences. She did not invite him up so much as fail to prevent it. She gathered the children and their things from the park bench with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been gathering children and their things alone for 3 years, and she moved toward the building, and he walked beside her, and neither of them made a decision about this as much as the situation made it for them. There was no version of this conversation that was going to happen on a park bench in the public afternoon. The children accepted his presence with the adaptability of 3-year-olds who had not yet developed the specific architecture of suspicion, and one of them, the taller one, asked him something in the elevator about his coat, specifically about the buttons, which were different from the buttons on coats he had apparently encountered before.
"They are good buttons."
And the child accepted this assessment and moved on to a different subject. The apartment was small and organized with the specific intentionality of someone who had learned to make small spaces work for more people than they were designed for. There were drawings on the refrigerator, a quantity of small shoes near the door that created its own topographical feature, and 2 small chairs at the kitchen table that were a different height from the other chairs and that had been positioned where the light from the window fell best in the afternoon. She had arranged the apartment around the children in the way that parents arranged spaces when there was no one else to arrange around, and the result was a space that was efficient and considered and entirely focused on the priorities of 2 small people. He took in all of this in the way he took in spaces, and he stood near the door and did not sit until she suggested it, and she did not suggest it until after the children had been given their afternoon snack and settled in the front room with something to occupy them, a process that she conducted with the calm efficiency of someone for whom this was the middle of a known sequence. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, and there was a period of quiet between them that was not uncomfortable but was very full, the kind of quiet that was created by the pressure of 3 years of unspoken things finding their order before any of them could be addressed. He looked at her. She looked at him, and then at the table, and then out the window at the side of the building next door, which was brick, and told her nothing, and she looked back at him. He had been prepared for many versions of this encounter over the 3 years he had been looking for her. He had run through scenarios and likely responses and probable emotional registers, had anticipated versions in which she was angry, and versions in which she was defensive, and versions in which she was simply exhausted from 3 years of carrying something that had been heavy. What he had not anticipated, and what he was encountering now in the kitchen of the apartment she had arranged around 2 children who had his face, was the quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of someone waiting to speak, but the stillness of someone who had already made their decisions and was present in the conversation without needing it to go anywhere in particular. He asked her who had told her to leave. He did not ask why she had left, because the why was already partially visible in the architecture of the last 3 years, in the 2 small people in the next room, in the careful distances she had maintained from any fixed point. He asked who had told her, specifically, because in the 6 months after she disappeared he had understood that the departure had not been entirely self-generated, had been shaped by information she had received, and in the 3 years since he had been working to understand the full shape of that information without being able to ask her directly. She told him about Constance Wren. She did not hurry the telling, and she did not editorialize it. She gave him the facts in the order she had received them, the meeting, the warning, the specific details of what Constance had told her about the marriage arrangement that had been under discussion, the threat she had described to the children Nadia was carrying, the advice that leaving quietly was the only way to ensure their safety. She watched his face while she told him, watching for the specific thing she had been watching for since she had seen him in the park, the tell that would indicate whether he had known, whether this had been a coordinated removal rather than a unilateral one. She watched carefully, and she did not find it. What she found instead was something she had not anticipated, which was the expression of a man who was hearing the mechanism of something he had been trying to reconstruct for 3 years, and was finding that the shape of it was worse and more specific than he had imagined. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. She heard one of the children say something in the front room, something directed at the other one rather than at either adult, and the normalcy of the sound sat strangely alongside the weight of the kitchen. He told her then, without ornamentation, the thing that had taken him 2 months after she left to decide. He had refused the marriage arrangement. He named the family, the alliance that had been under discussion, the pressure that had been applied, and the decision he had made and when he had made it. 2 months after she disappeared, he told her that he had understood when he made the decision that she was gone, that the news of the decision could not reach her because no one knew where she was, and that the news of the decision was also perhaps no longer relevant to her choices, since the choices had already been made. But he told her anyway, because she was sitting across from him, and she deserved to know it. She received this in the same way she had given her own information, without hurry, without editorialism. She sat with it, and he could see her sitting with it, could see the specific process of a person who was reorganizing a narrative they had been living inside for 3 years around a new piece of information, fitting it into the architecture and finding where it changed the meaning of other things and where it did not. The reorganization took time. He gave her the time. He was aware that outside the building the afternoon was moving toward evening, that his driver was still waiting, that the situation 3 cities away was still a situation, and he was also aware that none of those things were relevant to this kitchen, and this table, and this woman who was sitting across from him reconstructing 3 years of her own life. What she said when she finished reorganizing was not what he had expected. She did not express relief or grief or anger, all of which would have been reasonable and none of which would have surprised him. What she said was that she understood why Constance had told her what she had told her. That from the perspective of someone who had been in the organization for decades, who understood the value of the alliance that had been under discussion, who was looking at a situation in which an unofficial relationship was creating an obstacle to a significant political arrangement, the decision to remove the obstacle by giving it good reasons to remove itself was not an unreasonable decision. It was wrong. It had cost 3 years and 2 children their father, and a man his children, but it was the decision of a person operating within a specific logic, and she could see the logic, even if she had been the one who bore its cost. He looked at her for a long moment after she said this. The ability to see the logic of the thing that had been done to you without losing sight of the fact that it had been done to you was not a common quality, and he had known she had it. Had known it in the 2 years before the 3 years of not knowing her location, and having it confirmed now in this kitchen across a table that had 2 child-sized chairs at it, did something to the internal organization of the last 3 years that he could not fully articulate, but that he registered as ignificant. He told her there was a second reason he had been looking for her. Not the marriage, not Constance, not the explanation that had now been provided. A different reason, one that had its origins in the first year after she left and that had continued without interruption since. He told her that he had begun to change things. Not the surface things, not the visible operations, but the structure underneath them, the parts that his father had built in a different era according to a different logic, the parts that he had inherited and had spent the first years of his tenure maintaining, because maintenance was what you did when you were new to something that was already standing. He had begun to change those parts in the first year, alone, without knowing whether she was alive and without knowing whether she would ever be found. And the changes were still ongoing, 3 years later, because the kind of change he was making was not the kind that happened quickly or loudly, but the kind that happened steadily, the kind that was not announced but that was nonetheless real. She listened to this with the full quality of attention she had applied to everything else in the conversation, and he watched her listening, and he could see her understanding what he was saying and also what he was not saying, which was that the changes had not been made because he expected to find her or because he expected them to matter to her. They had been made because they were the right changes to make, and because in making them he had been the person he would have wanted to be if she had ever been present to see it, which was perhaps a strange logic, to make yourself into a better version of yourself for an audience you could not locate and might never find, but it was the logic he had been operating by, and it had produced 3 years of work that had not been done for show. The children came into the kitchen then, as children did at the end of the attention they had been willing to give a situation, and one of them climbed onto the chair next to Nadia and leaned against her arm in the casual way of someone for whom this arm was the most familiar surface in the world, and the other one stood on the other side of the table and looked at Declan with the frank appraisal he had been applying to him since the park, and then he climbed onto the chair next to Declan and sat down with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it. Declan looked at the child sitting next to him. The child looked back at him. The evening was coming in through the window and making the kitchen a warmer color than it had been, and outside the brick wall of the adjacent building was losing its definition in the fading light, and the apartment that had been arranged around 2 children was now containing the additional fact of a man who had spent 3 years looking for the woman who had arranged it, and all of these things were true at the same time, and none of them cancelled any of the others out. He did not leave that night. This was not a decision that was discussed or agreed upon in any direct way, but rather a condition that arrived through the accumulation of small facts. The hour had become late enough that the children's bedtime had happened, and the window for departure without disrupting that bedtime had closed, and then the hour had continued past the point where departing would have been unremarkable, and then they were sitting in the kitchen after the apartment had gone quiet, and neither of them had made the move toward ending the evening, and the evening had therefore not ended. He slept on the sofa under a blanket she set there without ceremony, and she went to bed in the room where the children were also sleeping in their own beds, and the apartment held all 4 of them in the dark November night. And whatever that meant was something they had not yet named. Morning arrived the way mornings arrived in apartments with small children. earlier than the adults would have chosen, and more immediately than the transition from sleep usually permitted. The children were up before 6, which she had told him nothing about, and so he was woken not by an alarm but by the sound of 2 3-year-olds discovering that the person they had encountered in the park was now on their sofa, which produced an immediate and energetic interest that resulted in both of them sitting on him in a way that was simultaneously very small and very decisive. He came fully awake with the specific abruptness of someone who had not slept in a space with children before, and whose nervous system had not yet learned to categorize the sounds they made as non-threatening. He lay on the sofa with one child on his shins and one on his chest, and looked at the ceiling, and conducted a brief internal assessment of his situation, and the situation was unusual by any standard he had previously applied to his mornings, and he lay there for another moment before he sat up. She was in the kitchen when he made his way there, moving through the breakfast routine with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom this sequence was so deeply rehearsed that it could be executed while also doing other things, in this case making coffee and responding to a work email on her phone, and periodically managing small disputes between 2 people who disagreed about the location of a specific spoon. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and watched this before she looked up and saw him, and the watching was not surveillance but something more like orientation, the process of understanding a life that had been constructed in his absence. Every part of it was competent and specific and organized around the needs of 2 small people, and there was no space in it that had been left empty for the possibility of him, which was not an accusation. It was simply the accurate description of what 3 years of solo parenthood looked like from the outside. She poured him coffee, and they ate breakfast with the children, who had decided to accept the morning's configuration with the same adaptability they had applied to everything else. The taller one, Lucas, was interested in asking questions, the specific investigative questioning of a child who was building a picture of the world one inquiry at a time and was not yet aware that some questions were considered more socially complex than others. He asked Declan where he lived, and when Declan named the city, Lucas considered this information and then asked how Declan had gotten to this city, and when Declan said by plane, Lucas asked how planes worked, and the conversation that followed was conducted entirely on Lucas's terms and covered more ground than Declan had expected, moving from planes to birds to whether birds got tired, and then to the specific question of whether the bird they had seen in the park yesterday was the same bird as the one they had seen on Tuesday, which had not been resolved to either twin's satisfaction. The smaller one, Leo, was less interested in interrogation and more interested in observation. He ate his breakfast with the focused attention of someone who did not believe in dividing his resources, and he looked at Declan at intervals with the assessing quality he had been applying since the park, the quality of a small person who was gathering data rather than asking directly. He looked at Declan's hands, which were different from his mother's hands in ways he was apparently cataloguing. He looked at the way Declan held his coffee cup, which was also different. He looked at Declan's face with the frank and undefended attention that children applied to faces before they learned that looking too long was considered impolite, and after a long looking he looked at his own hands and then back at Declan's hands, and something in the comparison registered in his face as a piece of information he was going to need time to process. After breakfast, Nadia took the children to their morning activity, which was in a building several blocks away, and which she conducted every weekday regardless of what else was happening, because consistency was the thing she had prioritized in their lives above almost everything else. The one predictable structure in a life that had moved 3 times in 3 years. She told Declan she would be back in an hour, and he said he would be there, and she looked at him when he said it in the way she had been looking at him throughout the previous evening and this morning, checking the statement against some internal standard she was maintaining, and she took the children and left, and he was alone in the apartment. He walked through it in her absence, not as a violation of her space, but as a continuation of the orientation process he had begun from the kitchen doorway. There were the drawings on the refrigerator, more of them than he had registered the night before, the particular drawings of 3-year-olds who were developing their understanding of form, circular heads, stick limbs, the occasional addition of what was probably meant to be hair. There were the books on the low shelf near the window, both the children's books and her own, the latter being a collection that told him things about what she had been reading in 3 years that he filed without drawing conclusions from, because conclusions would require context he did not yet have. There was the desk in the corner where she worked, which had the organized quality of someone who needed the desk to function and had arranged it accordingly. There were the photographs on the wall, and he looked at these longest. The children at various stages of the last 3 years, alone and together, and a photograph that appeared to be from a beach somewhere in the summer before last, and one of her with a woman he did not recognize who was the kind of person who appeared in photographs as a fixture rather than a visitor. There was no photograph of him. He had not expected one. He noted the absence not as a wound but as information. Information about how she had structured the 3 years in terms of what she carried and what she had set down. The apartment told a story about someone who had organized their life around what was present rather than what was absent, which was a healthy story, and which was also the story he would have hoped for her if he had been in a position to hope things for her across a 3-year gap in which he did not know whether she was well. He was sitting at the kitchen table when she returned, the children carrying the specific energy of small people who had been around other small people for an hour and had not fully expelled what that interaction had generated. She sent them to wash their hands with the instinct of someone who had learned to create transition rituals for the diffuse energy of 3-year-olds, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table in the same chair she had sat in the night before, and there was a quality of repetition in the arrangement that was not uncomfortable, a recognition that this was becoming a place from which conversations happened. She asked him about Constance, not about what had been done, or about the consequences, which they had covered the night before, but about what he knew in terms of the full scope of what Constance had done beyond the warning she had given Nadia. He told her. He told her that the investigation he had conducted in the months after her disappearance had revealed that Constance had not only told Nadia about the marriage arrangement, but had also, in the weeks following that conversation, systematically removed Nadia's contact information from the internal systems through which a search would normally have been conducted. She had not been crude about it, had not deleted records in ways that would have been detected, but had reclassified them in a way that placed them in an archive that was not routinely accessed, which meant that when he had tried to locate her through the organization's resources, the resources had found nothing. Not because nothing existed, but because the existing information was not findable through the channels he was using. The discovery of this had taken him 6 months, which was longer than it should have taken, and shorter than it might have taken if he had not been specifically suspicious of the information gap. When he had understood what had happened, he had gone to Constance directly, and she had not denied it. She had explained her reasoning in the same unembellished way she had explained every operational decision she had made in 40 years of service. The marriage arrangement was important. The informal relationship was an obstacle. The obstacle could be removed without violence if the obstacle was given sufficient reason to remove itself, and the kindest version of that reason was a warning that prioritized the safety of the person being warned. She had genuinely believed this. He had looked at Constance for a long time after she finished explaining herself. He had thought about the 40 years, about the institutional knowledge that walked out of the organization with her, about the specific quality of competence that was impossible to fully replace, and that had been in service to him and to his father before him. He had thought about all of that, and he had told her that she was no longer in her position, effective immediately, and that her continuation in any advisory capacity was also concluded, and that the organization was grateful for the service she had provided and understood that the service had been given in good faith, and that none of that changed what the service had cost. She had received this with the same calm with which she had received everything, had nodded once, and had left his office, and had not contacted him since. Nadia listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she understood the decision he had made about Constance and that she did not need it to be different from what it was. There was a specific quality in how she said this, a quality of someone who had thought about this already, not in the last 24 hours but in the 3 years before them, who had considered various versions of what the response to Constance would look like if it ever became a thing that was responded to, and had arrived at a position about what was proportionate. She did not want Constance's suffering as a form of justice. She wanted the fact of what had happened to be known and acknowledged, and the conditions that had made it possible to be changed. The changing of the conditions was already underway, from what he had told her the night before. The acknowledgement was happening in this kitchen. The knowing, which was the first of the three, had been hers for 3 years. The children came back from washing their hands, and the morning moved around the 4 of them in its ordinary way, and there was a moment in the middle of it, in the transition between the children wanting something and the wanting being addressed, when the 4 of them were in the same small kitchen doing 4 different things, and the kitchen was full in a way that was not chaotic but was dense with the specific weight of people sharing space in the way that people who shared something important shared space. And Declan looked up from the thing he was holding, a drawing that Leo had pressed into his hand without explanation, and he looked at the 3 of them, the woman across the kitchen and the 2 children who were navigating the space between them, and the drawing in his hand was of 3 figures, 2 small and 1 large, arranged in a row with their arms extending toward each other, and he did not know when Leo had made it, or whether it was meant to mean what it appeared to mean, but he held it carefully and did not put it down. The afternoon of the 2nd day arrived with the particular quality of afternoons that follow mornings in which significant things have been said and processed, and then set aside in favor of the ordinary requirements of small children who needed lunch and then a rest, and then the specific negotiation of the post-rest period, which was the time of day when 3-year-olds were most likely to have opinions about things that could not be easily resolved, and least likely to accept the resolutions that were offered. Declan had been present for all of this, not as a participant in the parenting but as a witness to it, and the witnessing had been its own kind of education in the specific texture of what Nadia's daily life contained, the sheer volume of attention and energy that 2 small people required, and that she had been supplying without assistance for 3 years. He had understood this in the abstract before he arrived at the apartment. He understood it differently now, which was the specific difference between knowing a fact and being in the presence of it for an extended period. The twins were napping in the early afternoon, which Nadia had navigated with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that the nap was both a necessity and a narrow window that had to be entered correctly, or it would not open at all. There was a ritual involved in the nap that was specific and sequential, and that he had observed from the doorway. The particular books in the particular order, the specific arrangement of the items on each small bed, the quality of quiet that she introduced into the room gradually rather than abruptly, calibrating the transition between activity and rest with the precision of someone who had learned through repetition exactly how much quiet was needed and at what rate it needed to arrive. The door closed. The apartment was suddenly and completely still in the specific way of apartments from which children's noise has been removed, a stillness that was not the absence of something but the temporary restoration of a different register of existing. She came to where he was standing near the window in the front room, and they moved to the kitchen table, which had become the place where conversations happened, and she made tea, and he watched her make it, and the afternoon light came in at the angle that afternoon light came in at in this apartment, and the light had a quality that was particular to late autumn in this latitude, a low golden quality that made everything it touched look as though it were in the process of being remembered rather than being presently experienced. He had told her the night before that there was a second reason he had been looking for her. He had told her the beginning of it, that he had begun to change things in the first year after she left. He had not told her the full shape of it, because the full shape of it was not something that could be entered from the beginning and followed to the end in a single telling, not without losing what was specific and particular about each part. He had been carrying it for 3 years, and it had the density of things that had been carried for a long time, compressed by the weight of the time they had been held. He was going to tell her now, with the apartment quiet around them, and the afternoon light doing what it did, and he was going to tell it in order. He began with the first month, not with what had happened to him emotionally in the first month, which he was not going to address directly because that was not the kind of territory he could navigate accurately, but with what had happened operationally. He had begun to look at the organization with a different set of eyes. Not the eyes he had been using for the 6 years he had been running it, which were the eyes of someone maintaining and managing a structure inherited from his father, and therefore understood through the lens of what his father had intended. The new eyes were the eyes of someone who had understood that what his father had intended was not necessarily what the structure needed to become, and who had begun to ask a different question, which was not, what does this organization require in order to continue, but what does this organization require in order to be something that a person who understood its full nature could choose to be part of. The question sounded abstract when he said it in those terms. It was not abstract when he described what it had produced. He described it in terms of specific changes and the reasons behind them, the parts of the organization that his father had built for a context that had existed 20 years ago and that had been maintained because maintenance was easier than rethinking, and the decisions he had made to dismantle those parts not quickly or dramatically but methodically over a period of time, in a way that absorbed the institutional disruption gradually rather than requiring it all at once. He described what this had cost in terms of relationships within the organization and in terms of the specific resistance he had encountered from people who had been with the organization long enough to believe that what existed was what should exist, because it had been existing for long enough to have the quality of inevitability. Nadia listened to all of this with the quality of attention she had been bringing to everything since the park, the full weight listening of someone who was not waiting for their turn to speak but was genuinely engaged with the information being offered, examining it for what it said about the person offering it and about the thing it described, and about what the combination of those two meant for the situation she was now in. He could see her listening, could see the specific expressions that moved across her face as she integrated each piece of information into the picture she was building, and what he saw in those expressions was not validation or approval, but something more complex than either, something that looked like a person who had been holding a fixed understanding of a situation for 3 years, and was discovering that the understanding was not wrong exactly, but was incomplete in ways that were going to require revision. He told her about the specific decision that had been the hardest, not in terms of the organizational resistance it had generated, which had been significant, but in terms of what it had required from him personally, a decision he had made about a revenue stream that his father had established and that had been a significant part of the organization's financial base, a revenue stream that he had concluded was indefensible when examined under the question he had begun asking after she left. The decision to remove it had taken 8 months of preparation and had resulted in a period of significant financial pressure on the organization, a period that required him to rebuild the financial base on different terms, which he had done, and which had taken another 14 months to accomplish. It was accomplished now. The organization was financially stable and the stability was built on things he could defend under the question he had been asking. He was telling her this not as evidence of virtue but as evidence of fact, because she deserved the facts, and because she was the only person to whom this specific accounting was relevant. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. The afternoon light had shifted while he talked, had moved further into the golden register as the day progressed toward its early winter end, and the kitchen had the quality of a room in which something significant had been said and had been received and was now being processed with the seriousness it deserved. He did not fill the quiet. He had learned, in 34 years of running things that required him to understand how people received information, that the filling of quiet was usually an act of the person doing the filling rather than a service to the person who needed the quiet. And what she needed was the quiet, and he gave it to her. When she spoke, she addressed the thing that he had expected her to address but had not been certain she would address directly, which was the question of why. Not why he had made the changes, which the changes themselves answered, but why specifically the change that had cost the most had been the one he chose to make. She asked it carefully, in the way she asked things that she understood were not simple, and he looked at her for a moment before he answered and thought about the various true things he could say and selected the one that was truest. He told her that in the first year after she left, in the months when he was conducting the investigation that eventually uncovered what Constance had done, and was simultaneously beginning to ask the question that led to the changes. He had understood something that he had known for a long time without having articulated it, that the parts of the organization he was most likely to defend as necessary were the parts he would have the hardest time explaining to someone who was not in it, but who was intelligent and honest, and who understood the world in the specific way that Nadia understood it. He had used her as a hypothetical audience for the internal argument he was conducting, had asked himself over and over again how he would explain each part of the organization to someone with her specific quality of judgment, and the parts that he could not explain had been the parts that needed to change. He had been using an imaginary version of her as a standard for 3 years without knowing whether the real version of her would ever be present to apply her own judgment. The imaginary version had been a working approximation. He was aware that it was an approximation. He was also aware that 3 years of using an approximation of someone as a standard had produced a relationship with that approximation that was not the same as a relationship with the person, and that there was something presumptuous in having allowed her hypothetical judgment to function as a guide without her knowledge or consent. She sat with this for a long time. The apartment remained quiet around them, and then from the direction of the children's room came the specific sounds of 2 3-year-olds emerging from their nap, a process that was gradual and then sudden, and that both of them heard and registered without moving toward it, because the emergence from the nap had its own rhythm that was best allowed to proceed at its own pace. One of them called for her, the particular quality of calling that was not distress but orientation, the locating call of a child who wanted to know that the familiar person was in the accessible vicinity.
I am in the kitchen.
And the locating was accomplished, and the sounds from the bedroom settled again temporarily before the emergence continued. She said that she had used him as a hypothetical audience as well, in the 3 years. She said it simply and without elaboration, because the fact was sufficient, and elaboration would have introduced a self-consciousness that would have changed what the fact was. She said that when she was making decisions about the children, about the places she lived and the work she took and the people she allowed into the proximity of the 2 small people she was responsible for, she had applied a standard that was not easily articulated, but that had something to do with what she imagined he would understand as the right kind of decision for the kind of life she was building. She had not been building it toward him, she said, because she had not known whether there was a him to build toward. She had been building it according to a set of values that she could not fully separate from the person she had understood him to be, or the person she had hoped he was. The children came into the kitchen then. Leo first, because Leo tended to be ahead of Lucas in transitions, and the kitchen absorbed them in the way it had been absorbing them throughout the day, naturally and without friction, and Declan looked at the 2 of them with the quality of attention that had been building since the park, the specific attention of someone who was understanding not just that these children existed, but that they were specific people with specific natures that had been developing for 3 years without him. Leo went immediately to his mother and leaned against her, the post-nap leanness that was his specific pattern, she had told him earlier, the way he reoriented himself in the world after the disruption of sleep. Lucas came around the table and stood beside Declan and said something about the drawing that Leo had given him earlier in the day, asking whether Declan still had it.
I have it.
Where is it?
In my jacket pocket.
Lucas appeared to find this information satisfying and moved on to the next thing, which was that he was hungry, and the next 20 minutes were organized around the hunger and its resolution, and the 4 of them moved through it together, and the moving through it together had, by the second day, begun to have the quality not of something being done for the first time, but of something that had been done before in a different configuration, and was now finding the new configuration, the one that contained all 4 of them. His phone was in his jacket pocket next to the drawing. It had been generating notifications for the last several hours related to the situation 3 cities away that had still not resolved itself, and that required his attention and would continue to require his attention regardless of what was happening in this kitchen. He was aware of this in the way he was aware of things that he had set aside temporarily and that were not going to remain set aside indefinitely. He had made a decision sometime in the last 12 hours, without formally making a decision, to let the situation 3 cities away be handled by the people he had designated to handle such things, which was an operational capacity he had spent 3 years developing specifically because the operational capacity of a single person, no matter how competent, was a structural vulnerability that competent organizations did not sustain. He had built the capacity and was now using it for the first time for a reason that was not operational in any of the ways he had imagined when he built it. He did not take the phone out of his pocket. She saw him not take it out, saw the small stillness that indicated the decision not to act on what he was aware of, and she saw the meaning of it. He could tell from the specific quality of how she saw it, the same quality she had been bringing to everything since the park, the quality of someone who was attending carefully to evidence of the kind she had learned to attend to in 3 years of raising 2 children, who were learning what people meant by what they did as much as by what they said. She said nothing about it. She did not need to. The not taking out of the phone was its own communication, and it had been received, and the kitchen continued around all 4 of them, with the food and the small opinions about the food and the afternoon becoming early evening outside the window, and the drawing was in his pocket next to the phone, and he was where he was, which was the only fact of the moment that mattered. A week passed and then another, and the shape of the days changed in the way that the shape of things changed when something new was being integrated into an existing structure, not dramatically, not in a single reconfiguration, but through the accumulation of small adjustments that individually seemed minor and collectively produced something different from what had existed before. He had gone back to the city for 5 days in the first week, because the situation 3 cities away required a level of direct involvement that the people he had designated could manage but not resolve, and because there were other things in the city that required his attention that could not be indefinitely deferred. He had gone back, and he had handled what needed to be handled, and on the 5th day he had returned to the apartment with the 4th-floor elevator and the drawings on the refrigerator, and neither he nor Nadia had discussed whether he would return because the question had been settled in the way that questions were sometimes settled, through action rather than through explicit agreement. The children had asked where he had gone while he was gone. Lucas had asked directly, in the way Lucas asked everything, as a factual inquiry requiring a factual answer. Where was the man who knew about buttons?
He had gone to his city for his work and would be back.
And Lucas had accepted this, with the same pragmatism he applied to information that arrived in clear form, and Leo had said nothing, which was how Leo processed things that required processing, and the 2 of them had returned to their day. When Declan returned on the evening of the 5th day, Leo had looked at him from across the front room with a quality of assessment that he was beginning to understand as Leo's specific mode of welcoming, the silent survey that preceded acceptance, and Lucas had come immediately to the door and said that a button on the jacket was different from before, which was true. He had worn a different jacket, and Lucas found this interesting, in the way Lucas found details interesting. The routine of the apartment established itself around him over the 2nd week in the way that routines established themselves around anyone who was consistently present in a space, not through decision but through repetition, through the accumulation of small defaults that became patterns and then became the way things were. He was the one who made coffee in the morning because he woke before she did, and the coffee was ready when she came into the kitchen, which had started as a practical fact and had become a small thing that the mornings contained. He was the one who walked with Lucas and Leo to the bench at the edge of the park, near the building where they had their morning activity, and waited with them at the door until the morning activity began, because Nadia used those 20 minutes for the work that required uninterrupted concentration, and he had offered to cover the walk without entirely planning to offer it, had heard himself offering it as she was preparing for the Tuesday morning, and had not retrieved the offer after it was made. The walk had become part of the mornings. He learned things about Lucas and Leo on the walks that he could not have learned otherwise. Lucas talked continuously, and the talking had a logic to it that was not always immediately apparent, but that revealed itself, if you were patient and did not redirect, and the logic was the logic of a child who was building a model of the world from its observable properties and who needed the building out loud in order to know where the pieces fit. Leo walked beside his brother and listened to the continuous talking with the slightly abstracted expression of someone who had been listening to this particular voice for the entirety of their existence, and had developed a specific relationship to it that was not quite attention and not quite inattention, but something more like ambient awareness, the way you were aware of music in a room you were working in. Leo participated when he had something to add, which was less often than Lucas, and the thing he added was usually something that shifted the model his brother was building in a direction Lucas had not considered, and Lucas received these additions with an openness that was one of the things Declan was coming to understand as characteristic. He called Nadia one evening while he was standing in the kitchen with the children asleep, and she was at the desk in the corner working on something that had a deadline, and he said her name the way he had said it in the park, quietly and without the shape of a question. And she looked up, and he said he was going to stay, meaning not just tonight, not just this week, but in the way that staying meant something larger than the immediate period. She looked at him for a moment with the quality of assessment she had been applying to everything since the park, the checking of what was actual against what was claimed, and what she found appeared to satisfy the standard she was applying, because she looked back at her work and said that the desk was going to need to be moved, because the light was wrong for the number of hours she was using it, and he said that he could move the desk now if she wanted, and she said not tonight, and went back to work, and he went back to the kitchen, and outside the window the city continued in the November dark, and the apartment contained all four of them in the specific way it was learning to contain all four of them. There was an evening near the end of the second week when Lucas asked him the question that Nadia had been expecting one of them to ask and that had not come until now, which was how it usually worked with questions that children were circling, the circling being its own kind of processing before the asking. They were on the sofa together after dinner, he and Lucas, with Leo on Nadia's lap across the room in the chair she used for the end-of-day reading, and Lucas had been quiet for an unusual amount of time, which was the specific kind of quiet that preceded something rather than following something. And then he said, without preamble, and with the directness that was his specific quality,
"Are you going to stay?"
The question was simple, and it was enormous, and it contained everything that a 3-year-old could mean by it, and more than that, and Declan looked at the top of his son's head, which was warm and present and resting against his side, and he looked across the room at Nadia, who had heard the question, and was looking at him with the expression she had been wearing since the park, but with a quality added to it that he had not seen before, something that was not waiting for an answer but was present for the answer, attending to it with the full weight of the last 3 years, and the weight of the 2 weeks, and the weight of everything that had been said at the kitchen table.
I am going to try very hard to stay.
He said it to Lucas, but he also said it to the room, to all 3 of the other people the room contained, because the answer was not only for Lucas, even though Lucas had asked it. Lucas thought about this for a moment, with the visible processing that was his characteristic, and then he appeared to find the answer sufficient, in the way that children sometimes found answers sufficient, not because the answer was everything they might have wanted, but because it was clearly the real answer, the unmanaged and unembellished thing, and children at 3 had a specific capacity to recognize the real thing when it was offered to them because they had not yet acquired the secondary systems that adults use to conceal it.
"Okay,"
and leaned back against Declan's side, and returned to whatever he had been thinking about before the question, which Declan suspected was the bird from the park, or possibly the buttons. 3 months after the park, the 4 of them were in a city that was none of the 3 they had each been living in separately. This was not an accident and was not entirely a plan either, but was the kind of outcome that resulted from 2 people making decisions together for the first time after 3 years of making them alone, decisions that had to account for the needs of 2 small people and the requirements of the work that both adults did, and the specific question of where all 4 of those sets of needs could be simultaneously met at an acceptable level. The city they chose was not perfect for any of them, and was workable for all of them, which was the kind of compromise that people who were building something real made, rather than the kind that people who were building something temporary made, and the difference was visible in the quality of the choosing, in the fact that they had walked through 11 places before they found the one that worked, that they had argued about the thing that was non-negotiable for each of them before they had looked at a single option, that they had looked at a school for Lucas and Leo before they had looked at apartments. The apartment they found had a kitchen with a window that faced east, which meant the morning light came in horizontally and made everything in the kitchen golden for the first 2 hours of the day, and the children's room had space for 2 beds and a significant amount of the floor to be occupied by the specific infrastructure of the play that Lucas and Leo conducted, which was elaborate and spatial, and required territory. There was a room for the desk, which had the right light this time, and there was a room that was not anything yet but would become something in time, and the becoming of it was one of the things that the next period contained. On the first morning in the apartment, which was a Saturday, Declan made coffee, and Nadia came into the kitchen, and the children came in shortly after, Leo leaning against her, and Lucas immediately interested in the new configuration of the kitchen and what it contained that was different from what the last kitchen had contained. The morning light was doing what it did in this kitchen, which was considerable, and the 4 of them were in the new kitchen, in the new city, in the new configuration that was not new anymore but had become, over 3 months, the configuration. And Leo looked at Declan from his position against his mother's side, and then looked at the drawing that was now on this refrigerator, the drawing of the 3 figures with their arms extending toward each other that Leo had made and that had traveled in the pocket of a coat from one city to another and had been transferred to this refrigerator on the evening of their arrival. And Leo looked at the drawing, and then at the 4 of them in the kitchen, and then back at the drawing again, and whatever he understood from the comparison he kept for himself, in the way he kept most of his understandings, and leaned against his mother's side, and the mourning continued around all of them in the ordinary and unremarkable way of mornings in which nothing particular is happening and everything that matters is present.